I'm going to start then. So I think we've got quite a few guys here. There will be that noise, Jaimal, as other people join a little bit late. So that's fine. We just crack on. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to WMUK webinar. This, I think, is our 6th in our series going through the summer. And today I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Jaimal Kothari from Oxford University Hospitals. He's a consultant haematologist there. He's also one of our trustees at WMUK. So welcome, Jaimal. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Bob, and thanks everyone for joining.
And Jaimal is going to share with us this morning a talk about clinical trials, what, why, and how. And I think this subject has cropped up a lot lately on all of our virtual support group meetings and our regional support group meetings. Some of us have been on clinical trials, some of us, or most of us haven't, but a lot of us ask what they are, why might we be put on them, and how do they work? So Jaimal, I hope, is going to answer those questions for us this morning. So over to you, Jaimal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Bob, and thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for the invitation to coming to speak to you all today. In terms of what I was hoping to cover today, there's going to be a chunk on really the process of clinical trials. I mean, what are they? What are the different phases? How do they work? So the sort of structure and a little bit about the governance. So it hopefully will give you practical information in terms of if you are approached for a clinical trial or you think that you may want to. I think having that knowledge is useful. And then, of course, I will talk a little bit about the specifics in terms of what's happening with clinical trials in WM at the moment, and I'm sure then there'll be some time for some questions as well. So the key questions that one needs to think about is well, what are the different phases of clinical trials? Because people use terminology like phase 1, phase 3, phase 4, very interchangeably sometimes, and it's hard to know what actually means. And of course, the key things are, what are the risks to me? What are the potential benefits for me? And how do I find out? How do I find out if at whatever point in my WM journey I am at, is there a clinical trial, whether it be a trial of new drugs or combinations of new drugs and old drugs? Are there other trials which are looking at different aspects of quality of life or the supportive care or how to prevent infections? There can be many different types of trials that one can get involved in, and it's important to know where you can also get that information from. So the question is that people from the lab come up with new drugs, new ideas, new targets, and the question is obviously this is not a true example of the kind of people that come to us, but of course the question is well, how do you test these drugs? What do you need to know, and what are the stages before you can actually start doing trials in human subjects? And I'm sure a number of you have keen historical minds as well. Sadly, over the last 50, 60, 80 years, the way in which humans were used as clinical trial subjects has not always been very ethical. And in the 60s, there's a huge amount of regulatory work done worldwide to make sure that the whole purpose of clinical trials is to ensure the safety and integrity of the participants, and to make sure that they have all the information that they need to know whether they decide to go into the trial or not. So before we even think about whether we're going to get to the stage where humans are given this drug, we need to know so much. How does it work in the lab? Often you're able to take human cells and grow them in certain ways and test the drug in test tubes to see what kind of effects it has on killing cancer cells, for example. What might the side effects be? Sometimes you can get a clue from how the drug works and the understanding of human biology. How are you going to give the drug. And importantly, it's like once the drug is given, how do you get rid of it? Does it go through the liver, which then makes it important because many drugs are processed in the liver, or does it go through the kidneys? They're the main two ways in which humans metabolize drugs. Animal work is crucial because without animal work, you can't design a trial safely. And it gives you very important information on dose, side effects, how to treat the side effects. And, you know, it's important to say that animal research is extremely closely regulated and every effort is made to prevent animals from suffering. And although it's vital, mice and other small animals that are used in this sort of work are not humans. And despite the best animal work, sometimes surprises can happen. But, you know, once you've got through the phases of the preclinical work and you are in the position where you say, okay, we can do, you know, a first in human trial. First in human trials happen at many big centres throughout the UK, and these are phase 1 studies. Okay, now not all phase 1s have to be first in human, but you know, phase 1 studies are essentially key studies in working out whether you're going to take the drug further, and it's going to eventually become, you know, part of the armamentarium that we have in any disease. And it's important to say that, you know, whatever drugs you may or may not have been exposed to, whether it be ibrutinib, rituximab, cyclophosphamide, whatever, all of these drugs have been through phase 1 studies. So there will have been other human beings at various different stages of their illness being the people where these drugs were tested on for the first time. And at that point in time, they didn't know that, you know, their drug rituximab was going to become, you know, the cornerstone of the way we treat so many non-Hodgkin lymphomas. So the aims of phase 1 is to find out the dose and to find out the side effects. The key thing is that it's not the main purpose of a phase 1 study to see how well it works. And there are a variety of strategies that you can use to try and understand what dose to use and what toxicity you may get or expect from different doses. And there are various and now more interesting sort of mathematical models used to try and ensure that actually you keep people as safe as possible and you don't expose too many people if you think you're getting unexpected toxicities. So they've become increasingly clever over the last 5, 10, 15 years. But the key thing to say is that, you know, it's about the dose and side effects are absolutely the key things that you want to find out from a phase 1 study. So a phase 2 study is often also about side effects, but also it gives you key information. Well, how well does this drug work? Okay, so these trials can be single arm, so everyone gets the new drug, or they can be randomized. Okay, so some get the new drug and some don't, and you're comparing both the arms. Okay, so I'm not going to cover this a bit later. An important thing to say about studies in Waldenstrom's is that there are, most of the studies that are in the literature for Waldenstrom's are phase 2 studies, and this can be problematic. And the reason why they're phase 2 studies is because of course it is a rare condition, and practically speaking, to understand that aspirin was a good intervention in heart attacks, a lot of the original studies were done in Oxford in the 80s. These studies had 3,000 to 4,000 patients on, and you can do a 4,000 patient study in heart attacks in 18 months potentially. But of course, you can't do studies that size in lots of areas of cancer, and you can't in Waldenstrom. So sometimes you have to work out how to design studies that still give you useful information, but are a size that means you can get the information within a useful time period, so you can then hopefully then use those results to to help people. Okay. Phase 3 studies, these are often called the registration studies in cancer. And it's a key thing to try and understand, is it better than what we have at the moment? Okay, so the key to a phase 3 study is a randomization. Okay, so often, using this, example, if you take rituximab as a standard treatment, okay, so you have all patients with lymphoma, or let's say WM, and then you randomize. Okay, so you randomize, against rituximab, which is a standard treatment, or you use this new drug. Okay, now to extrapolate this directly to a phase 3 study in Waldenstrom's, is that there was a study of single agent rituximab plus a placebo versus ibrutinib plus rituximab. So that was the study that was used to gain, one of the key studies to get a license for rituximab plus ibrutinib in WM. So that phase 3 study in Waldenstrom's was 150 patients, and to be honest, to get that many patients was quite a success. So 150 patients is about as big as a WM, and bigger than pretty much most WM studies you're going to get. And when you have this randomized study, for example, well, how do you know what's happening? So you can scan people regularly, you can do response assessments to see what's happening to the IgM, and then there are key criteria that then decide whether you can stay on the study or you have to come off, which are based around the criteria to ensure that you only stay on the trial, if the drug is working. Okay, so the using that study as a good example. The reason why that was also a very good study is that it was placebo controlled. So, people didn't know whether they were getting, ibrutinib or placebo. Now, of course, if you start getting some of the side effects that are more typical for ibrutinib, you know that you're on the active agent rather than the placebo. But it's surprising how many side effects placebos can have, and it is the gold standard to use a placebo where you can. Okay, randomization is important. It's crucial, and it's one of the key ways in which you can remove bias from a trial. Okay, and you can do a randomized study that doesn't include a placebo. Okay, and if there is a placebo, you will always be told that you could receive the placebo, and that's a very, very important point. Okay. It isn't usually completely random, because when you have two arms of a study, you want to make sure that there are factors that you need to balance out. For example, people who potentially have make sure you have the same number of women and men in the arm, for example, and other factors to make sure that actually you've tried to remove any factors that could hinder interpretation of the study. But practically speaking, they're always factors that you have to bear in mind when you're looking at the results. Okay. This is an example from a high-grade lymphoma, where this is just a way in which you look at the results. It's like, well, what difference does adding a new drug make? And this is one of the classic examples of the benefit of rituximab adding to a combination of drugs called CHOP, which we don't typically use in WM, but occasionally may be used. Okay, so there's a long process from start to finish. And I think, over the years, there have been criticisms of drug development and cancer drug development, is that the whole process takes too long from start to the point where you're actually know you've got a safe licensed drug and you can actually use it. And it does take a long time. I guess one of the key examples over the last 18 months during the pandemic is that when you have a good national clinical trial infrastructure, and you have a condition like COVID-19 where, sadly, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of potential trial candidates, you can do big trials very, very quickly. And actually, some of the sort of practice-changing, life-saving COVID-19 trial work was all done in the UK, and actually with the trial unit that was based in Oxford. Phase 3 trials are important because it's very easy to extrapolate from data that is not as rigorous. Smaller studies, phase 2 studies, sometimes give you answers that when you do the study again with a bigger sample and using a proper control arm, you show that there is no difference. And this is a classic example, again, using CHOP, which is this very common lymphoma combination, is when people did a proper randomized trial comparing to other combinations which seemed to work as well. It was shown that essentially there was no difference, okay, between the arms in terms of how well these drugs worked. So, sometimes the most important result you get from a clinical trial is that there is no difference between what you were doing and what you think is better. But that benefit may have actually been magnified in an earlier phase study. So that's why, where we can and where practically speaking, you want to do phase 3 trials. But sometimes in in WM, you have to, use phase 2 data. You have to extrapolate from other areas of lymphoma, which has its challenges, but you have to work with practically what you can do and what you can get. So I've mentioned a little bit about this already. There are problems, and I think certainly there can be studies coming out of especially the big centers in the States that can attract many patients. You'll get a clinical trial, say, with 30 patients or 20 to 30 patients who have all been treated in or 2 or 3 or sometimes even 1 center, and the data that you get from that kind of study is clearly very important, and it's often the way in which we first start to see what new drugs are available, and is it safe, number one, in WM patients, and how well does it work. But it may be a little bit skewed because sometimes the way US medicine works, people fly 3,000 miles across the country because they insist that they want to be seen at the Mayo Clinic or at the Dana-Farber, and often the trial population that you get may not be representative of what more represents the day-to-day people who potentially need treatment. So that doesn't mean you of course ignore the results, because any information that is peer-reviewed and published will help us in the future, but it means that you need to think about the data carefully and understand what the pros and cons are of, and as clinicians, it's up to us and our peer review and our meetings to discuss them and challenge each other to make sure that we understand the data, which means that we can appropriately use it in the decisions that we that we make. An important thing to say is that I think a number of you will probably be eligible for studies in due course, where the trial drug is available for all of relapsed indolent non-Hodgkin B-cell lymphoma, for example, and CLL. So there are trials which have cohorts of patients. So you can go into the trial if you have CLL, if you have marginal zone lymphoma, if you have follicular lymphoma, if you have WM. We have a study like that in Oxford at the moment. So they are helpful because they do certainly allow you to get exposed and get options to newer drugs at an earlier phase. And although it's not a WM study, some of these trials are so big that actually they're putting in the number of patients in the WM cohort, for example, can be bigger than some actual published studies with pure WM. So that's an important point to mention. Okay, so what's happening in WM trials at the moment? So let's just talk a little bit about this. I think in upfront WM at the moment, so we have a national study called the Rainbow Study, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. I've got a slide on the Rainbow Study, which is for people who need to start treatment, so who haven't had any treatment up to date, but the point has come, either from the point of diagnosis or after a period of watch and wait, that they need to start treatment. The key question in the Rainbow Study is it's a randomized phase 2 study, so it's not a phase 3 study, it's a phase 2 study of a very standard rituximab-based induction chemotherapy, which many people use and still use appropriately, and I'm guessing a number of people on this in this meeting will have had this combination as well. So it's a combination of rituximab, cyclophosphamide and dexamethasone DRC chemotherapy given for 6 cycles every 3 weeks, versus a combination of ibrutinib plus rituximab. So the BTK inhibitor ibrutinib, used as frontline treatment. So this is an important study for a variety of reasons. Thankfully, we know that as a general rule, people with WM are in a position to live for many years with their condition, and hopefully for long periods of time with optimal quality of life, and potentially not on treatment. So with the BTK inhibitors such as ibrutinib, and I'm going to talk about some of the other BTK inhibitors as well in a minute in the context of clinical trials, these are continual therapies, and you stay on the drug until it stops working. I think, which is fine if you don't have side effects. But of course, if you have side effects, then the effect on quality of life can be very, very significant. So, when you see a combination of 6 cycles of chemotherapy versus ibrutinib, which may continue for years, you may think, well, it's obvious that rituximab and ibrutinib is going to be better. But the question is well, how do you define, what is better? And there are various ways of, defining the endpoints. Of course, there are endpoints such as, well, how long can the disease be controlled? So in conditions where people live for many, many years, we talk about, progression-free survival as an endpoint in the clinical trials. That means how long from the start of treatment will the combination of drugs you're using control it until the disease progresses, okay? Till the IgM starts going up over a certain level, or areas of lymphadenopathy start growing on a CT scan, okay? Now, I think everyone accepts that rituximab and ibrutinib is going to have a better progression-free survival, but it hasn't been shown. So this trial will show it. But also there is significantly a big attraction for many people, understandably, for having 18 weeks of treatment and then stopping treatment and then not being on anything. And even at the point where the WM progresses, for example, that in itself is not an indication always to restart treatment. So, and when you're not on treatment, you're not getting complications from being on continual therapy. So this study is going to collect a lot of information on toxicity, the quality of life of potentially being, on a drug that is absolutely controlling the WM. But, I think what is often, not well explained to patients and to clinicians, and sometimes clinicians don't think about it as much as they should, is that, a low-grade toxicity from a drug that you're on for, 3, 4, 5 years can make your life completely miserable. Just because your IgM is low, that doesn't mean that life is good. Now, of course, we want those things to basically equate to the same thing, but they don't always mean that. And that's why, looking at a study where you're trying to get information on, the toxicity and the kind of effects that you have on continual therapy, is really important. I think what everyone accepts is that, which combination you have first is not going to affect how long you live, okay? So it's not going to affect what we call overall survival, because on balance, people who have DRC first, when they progress, will have some sort of BTK inhibitor as second-line treatment in most situations. So then you get, control, later on down the line with a BTK inhibitor. So I think there's a number of reasons why this study is important, and it's the national frontline study for WM, and it's open in many centres throughout the country. I think they're hoping to open about 50 odd centres, I think, and it's about 130 patients. So irrespective of where you live in the country, I think you will certainly find a centre that's offering the Rainbow study, hopefully not too far away from you. And you can always go via CRUK or WMUK, and I've got the addresses later to check what sites are potentially open for this. Okay, so in terms of relapsed WM, the study that we have, there's one national study called Pembro WM, which is my study. I'm the chief investigator of the study. So this is a study looking at the combination of a drug of rituximab, which you'll be aware of, and a drug called pembrolizumab in patients with relapsed refractory disease. Okay, so this is going to be this is running in about 7 UK sites at the moment, and we're looking for 42 patients in general. Now, the rationale for this study, I mean, there's scientific rationale, and there's also a practical rationale. The pembrolizumab is in a class of drugs called the PD-1 inhibitors. Now, this is a very big class of drugs that have been very, very, very successful in solid oncology in patients with lung cancer, colorectal cancer, melanoma. And what these drugs do is one of the great sort of there's still, of course, many great mysteries in cancer. One of the things that people have been looking at, very clever people have been looking at over many, many years, is that, well, how does the immune system not realize that the cancer shouldn't be there, and why doesn't the immune system kill the cancer? I mean, this is a crucial thing, and over the last few years and now moving forwards, we're increasingly better understanding the interactions between the immune system and cancer. And essentially, there is a type of interaction between cells which stop cells of the immune system, T cells, from recognizing cancer. And to sort of cut a long story short, drugs like pembrolizumab re-enable that interaction. Okay. And drugs like pembrolizumab, and pembrolizumab is licensed in Hodgkin's lymphoma, and drugs of a similar class are also licensed in Hodgkin's. And it does look like these drugs do certainly potentially have a role in non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And this is the first study that's actually looking to combine, to use this class of drugs in patients with WM. So we used it with rituximab because rituximab for many years has been the cornerstone of our of the way in which we treat patients with relapsed WM, and a combination has been used in similar low-grade lymphomas, and it's been shown to be safe. Okay. Now, in terms of what is the group of patients we're looking to treat it in, is the patients that have been exposed to BTK inhibitors. Okay, so people will have a first-line treatment, typically of DRC chemotherapy or maybe rituximab and bendamustine, and then appropriately, most people are then given ibrutinib, and later on this year, zanubrutinib, which is a newer BTK inhibitor, is going to become available as well, potentially for WM. And we know that this is a great class of drugs and it can work extremely well. Okay, but it has been shown, unfortunately, that maybe 20% of people will come off ibrutinib within the first year because it doesn't work, or they're just intolerant. And that's certainly data that has been published. And the question is, well, after a BTK inhibitor, what's the best combination of drugs to use? I think the thing to say is that there are many things you can do. You can go back to chemotherapy. There are other approaches, but there is no standard of care, and that's where we want to use this combination and that's why we've designed the trial specifically for this group of patients. So there's definitely 7 sites open. You will see from the geographical link, there is one site that I forgot to put on there, that is Manchester. Actually, it is open in Manchester as well with Kim Linton. Manchester is the furthest north, in the northwest. We don't have any sites in the northeast or the Midlands, and it unfortunately is skewed a little bit to the south and the west and the east. But again, this is certainly a study that people can potentially travel for, but we can talk about the pros and cons of that in due course. So that's the rationale of that study. Now, in terms of other clinical trials in WM that are open at the moment, so here I've mentioned LOXO-BTK, so just a word on this, and also a word on MK-1026-003, because these drugs are both novel BTK inhibitors. So ibrutinib, acalabrutinib, zanubrutinib, we're very lucky to have this class of drugs, and we're lucky that at least we have access to ibrutinib in relapsed WM via the Cancer Drugs Fund for our patients in the NHS. Eventually, when drugs in the class of ibrutinib stop working, it can be because certain mutations means that the WM stops being responsive. A new class of BTK inhibitors have been developed, which bind BTK is an enzyme which bind the enzyme in a different way, and these have been shown to be effective and also very, very well tolerated. So one of the drugs is called LOXO. I can't remember the name of it. I think it's pirobrutinib, I think. But this study is also open in Oxford, and this is a study, like I mentioned, where you have different cohorts. Cohorts for CLL, marginal zone lymphoma, follicular lymphoma, and WM. And actually, I mean, not in Oxford, but they've actually, worldwide, they've put in 50 patients in WM with this drug, and I think we're going to be seeing data actually probably the end of this year to have a look at the how well it works and the tolerability. And this class of drugs is not going away. And I think it is the future of BTK inhibition, are drugs like Loxo, and also a similar drug called MK1026, which is a very similar drug. But again, this is a new BTK inhibitor. So these drugs are available for patients who have failed ibrutinib. So you can actually have failed a standard BTK inhibitor and then go on to this, or for patients that have never been exposed to a BTK inhibitor. MK1026 is also going to be open in Oxford. I'm going to be running that study, probably going to be opening in the autumn. And one other study that is going to be opening later this year, I think only at UCH, is this we can see Clover WAM1. So this is interesting and something slightly different. It's using a radio-labeled isotope, which targets specifically to WM cells. The idea of radio immunotherapy, so radio-labeled drugs which have radioactivity attached to them and hone to the specific areas of cancer, have been looked at in hematology before. There was a drug which is actually a sort of a radioactive version of rituximab. There's a couple actually that never took off for a variety of reasons. But again, this is something now that is being looked at again in patients with B-cell cancers, including WM. And Shirley Desar is going to be running that study at UCH later in the year. And that's a completely different approach. It's not like being on a tablet long term or having a number of cycles of treatment. I think you actually just get 2 doses of a radio-labeled drug, which hones its way to the WM cells, and then that's the whole defined treatment basically. So the point being is that we have options. We have options in frontline WM and also in relapse. And the hope is, of course, that if it's right for you, there's going to be places that are not too far away where you can have it. Okay, so now just a bit more general about the risks and benefits. If you decide you're at the point in your treatment journey where you would like to consider a trial, or at least think about talking about one, what are the risks? Of course, one of the major risks is it might not work. This is much less likely for a phase 3 study, because normally in a phase 3 studies, both arms have been shown to be effective, and they're just trying to work out which one is better. Or a phase 3 study may be standard of care versus standard of care plus one new drug. So the hope is that it will work. It might be harmful. This can happen. It's rare, but it can happen. An example for that is a drug called venetoclax, which again, is a drug we'd like to have access to in WM, but we don't. When it was first trialed in CLL, it was so effective, it caused problems with people's kidneys, and it was very problematic initially. But now we know how to manage that. But it was only through the very early clinical trials that became apparent. Travel can be a problem. On commercial studies, so studies that are run by pharmaceutical companies, that travel is generally reimbursed. But on studies that are not being run by the pharmaceutical company, like the Rainbow study isn't, and my study, WM Pembro, isn't, the travel is usually not reimbursed. In general, it does involve more tests, more blood tests, and more biopsies. But as a general rule, that those are not usually very, very different to what would happen in a standard of care setting. And it's not usually an extra needle with extra blood tests. It's usually just extra samples sometimes. Sometimes you do have more scans because of the nature in which you have to report responses. And it's very important to know very formally when a response ends and progression may be happening from a sort of regulatory perspective. What I'd say about that from a WM perspective is that often, in WM, people don't have enlarged glands or spleens. And if that's been shown to be the case at baseline, then you're not going to necessarily need to have all of those extra scans. And if it's a randomized trial, you may not get the new drug. I think the best example of that is on the rituximab ibrutinib versus ibrutinib rituximab placebo. Of course, I think most people, when they took part in that study, were hoping that they would get the ibrutinib, but they didn't. But it should be noted that many of the patients who progressed a bit earlier because they got the placebo got ibrutinib after that. And, the results were positive in terms of, the time progression free rather than any difference of time that people lived on both of those arms. And that's an important point to make. The benefits are that you may get a new drug much earlier than would be available through standard means. Progress in treating people with drugs relies on patients participating in clinical trials. That's clearly not an individual benefit, but that's just a basic point. I think absolutely it can be thought of as an added line of treatment in situations where you have access to a drug at a different time point or that wouldn't be available at all. But it's really important to know that if you decide to go on an early phase study, like a phase 1 study, people understandably want to go on a phase 1 study because intuitively you hope that you're going to get some kind of benefit from it, but one should really never think about getting benefit from an early phase or a phase 1 study. So there are a variety of ways to find out. WMUK certainly is a way of finding out about clinical trials. And also, if they don't know, they can get in touch with someone very quickly who will know where the trial is potentially happening or what are the issues specifically around it. CRUK have a clinical trial finder tool as well, which I've put up there as well. Of course, I think the forums and other sort of areas as well, and social media is increasingly becoming good at sort of signposting people to the right places. So how to take part? Speak to whoever looks after you day to day. If you find a trial on a website, absolutely go in and speak to your clinician or your team and find out whether it's something that would be right for you. And if it's not available locally, you can ask to be referred. That happens, all the time, and people are always more than happy to do that as a general rule. I mean, if they're not willing to do this, you can always get in touch with a site directly. You can always get in touch with WMUK. But I think people, as a general rule, what they don't want to do is waste your time. And sometimes, because of the nature of clinical trials, there are very specific criteria which sometimes stop people from being eligible where they think they would be. And then there's nothing worse than that sort of build-up of expectation. And then you find out for whatever reason you can't go onto the trial. And I'm just going to talk a bit about that now, actually. So what is the process? So you have that initial conversation between whoever is running the trial and the local clinician, and then say you're referred to me. So before the point that you actually come and see me or Rebecca Auer or Shirley or whoever it is, often there's been a sort of initial discussion and review of the notes and results to make sure that the person is eligible. Now, for example, there are very strict entry criteria and exclusion criteria, usually taught 10 to 15 inclusion and exclusion criteria, which mean that you're kind of treating a sort of homogeneous population as possible, which makes the trial easier to interpret, but also a number of these inclusion and exclusion criteria are done for safety reasons as well. So an example for that might be renal function. So if people's renal function are not above a certain limit, as a general rule, in a variety of disease areas, including WM, depending on the drug, you won't be eligible for the trial. So there'll be an initial conversation where they'll, sometimes I'll email out the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and the doctor will say, yeah, okay, this is fine, there's no issue here. So then they come to be seen. The trial is again discussed again in some detail, and something called the patient information sheet is given, the PIS. Now these are problematic documents for a variety of reasons, but essentially what is very important is that people have the information that they need to make an informed choice whether they wish to go into any clinical trial which is outside of standard of care. But of course, even within standard of care, people are consented for a variety of reasons. Now, when they're new drugs or any drug, a lot of information about potential toxicities of drugs are packed into these patient information sheets, often in ways that are completely unintelligible. And this is an area that people are looking at actively and trying to work out how to provide information in an easier to digest way. People are looking at providing videos as patient information sheets, as well as the standard information sheet. The issue is as well is that they're sort of, they're not formally legal documents, but whatever drugs are being tested, you know, there needs to be enough information on there so that, you know, whoever the sponsor of the trial is, whoever makes the drugs, who've given the pharmaceutical companies, they need to be legally secure, so that you know, people can't go back and say, you know, get a side effect, whatever the side effect is, and you know, they're worried about legal recourse, basically. But what I would say is that, you know, no one wants to wrong anyone when you're doing these things, and it's a delicate balancing act between providing helpful, informed information and sort of, you know, mumbo jumbo that's basically uninterpretable. And then a lot of people just say, I've read through it, and I'm on what I've been given, and from my other speaking to people, and you know, and speaking to you, I'm happy to go ahead and, you know, sign the consent. And I think the important thing to say about really consent for anything in a healthcare setting is that, you know, you can sign consent on Monday and withdraw it 10 minutes later. I mean, you know, in any clinical trial, I always tell people that you're in control of being on the trial. Okay, you may not be in control of your illness, of course you're not. You know, we all live in a variety of ways with lots of things we can't control. But you know, you may decide after a cycle or a minute or an hour, or you're just not happy about something that you don't want to carry on, then you don't have to carry on. And actually, not everyone is aware of that until they're first told. Some people actually think once they sign up for the trial, that's it. They have to sort of see the whole thing through, and it's not that at all. Okay. So people have to be given at least 24 hours in between giving the patient information sheet and then returning to sign the consent form. And then after doing a consent, you go through what's called a screening process, where you have a bunch of tests, blood tests, scans, bone marrows, etc., to make sure that all the criteria are appropriate and they fit, and all those results are discussed with the sponsor of the study, the sponsor that's legally in charge of running the study, to make sure that you're eligible for the study. If you are eligible, then you're registered. If it's a randomized study, then they do effectively the virtual coin toss, which decides what treatment you're on, and then the trial treatment is started. And that can continue until the patient withdraws for whatever reason. There is toxicity that is at a level that is dangerous, which would mean it would be too dangerous to continue. Okay, which I have to say, you know, happens extremely rarely in the kind of studies that we're doing at the moment. It happens rarely in you know, in later phase studies, but it does happen. Or until progression, and that progression is formally defined in WM, and that's related to when IgM levels get above a certain point, or things change on a scan, which is also indicative of progression. So they're very formalized processes, which, you know, are measured at certain time points as dictated by the study. And this is just an example of that process. You're consented. This is from the pembrolizumab rituximab study. Then you have screening and registration. Then you have the treatment, which carries on for however many cycles it continues for. And you have then those response assessments that I talked about, and then there is a follow-up phase of many clinical trials where people are followed up just to see how they're getting on. But this is usually quite light touch, but it's helpful to gain as much information over a sort of prolonged time period, as much as practically possible, as determined by the study. And I think that's all I was going to talk about today.
Thank you, Jaimal. Well, that was so interesting for me. Anyway, I found that really interesting and really informative. Thank you so much. I'd heard about clinical trials, but I didn't know a lot about how they worked, the geography of them. So thank you for that. We've got about 20 minutes left. I hope you can stay with us for about 20 minutes. I'm going to take some questions in a minute. But interestingly, that patient information sheet, I've just spent the weekend as a trial filling out one for Shirley Dessar on that radioactive trial she's going to be starting later. I just want to reassure everybody that it's really well written, and I made a couple of comments that would concern me if I was signing up for that trial, and I fed them back to her, and she will feed those back to the sponsors, as you mentioned. So, and another one of our trustees is also filling out the form. So even those forms are trialed before they're presented to us as patients. So that was interesting. Another one you touched on was, and it's really important to some of our guys, some of who are on this meeting this morning, is this whole geographical thing about, and you've covered it, I know, but if I live in the northeast of England, and the trial involves, some clinical procedure where I've got to go to hospital, is that something that can be arranged locally, or have I got to come down to Oxford and see you?
Yeah, anything for the trial has to be done in the trial centre, unfortunately.
Okay, right.
But what I would say is,
unless it's a drug, an actual oral drug, can the oral drug, can that be done locally?
I mean, people come in for their cycle and they go home with it for 28 days. Yeah. So if you're on an oral therapy drug, often you have to do a trial visit every 28 days. Yeah. So it may be that you have a long day every month where you go and pick up the drugs, and you try and organize whatever investigations you need on the same day. But logistics are not always straightforward. No. But what I would say is that, irrespective of where people live in the country, often big centres do have active trial units, and there will be these studies with new agents where lots of different bits of sort of non-Hodgkin lymphoma have different cohorts. Like a lot of these studies are open in quite a few places, so it would be unusual for people to really, unless they live in a very very rural area. But even then, hopefully people would be able to get in a position to sort of get to a big centre to discuss potential trial options. Okay, thank you. And I know that people listening will be in Scotland, and it's a whole different ball game up there. So please, that's something WMUK are currently looking at. So I know you're jumping up and down in your seats right now, but we are aware of the problems in Scotland. Jaimal, I want to open up to some questions. Can you take off your shared screen so I can see who's on the screen? Great. So if you've got a question for Dr. Jaimal, stick your hand up. First one I see is nobody. Hold on, let me go to my second page. Anybody on this page want to ask a question? Oh, a lot of you aren't, I can't see. Well, okay. Well, I've got a question for you. Nobody's got a question, no? Okay, thank you. I've got a question for you, Jaimal, and it's not about clinical trials, but I've mentioned it to you earlier. You are also the co-chair of the Thames Valley multidisciplinary team for myeloma, not for WM, but in your role, something that's cropped up many times recently in my dealings as the patient support manager is that we get phoned because of COVID, we're getting phoned, or when we are going back in to see a consultant, we don't actually see our consultant. So I don't see Helen McCarthy, somebody living in Oxford doesn't actually see you. We end up seeing a registrar. But I want to, and I've tried to reassure people that this thing called a multidisciplinary team exists. Can you just explain to us, please, what that is and how it does it, how it helps us, and how we're not being fobbed off, we are, we're being looked after properly? Yeah, sure. I mean, it's essentially a sort of, a group decision-making process where you have all relevant specialists that are involved in taking care of a particular disease area. So for, lymphoma, for example, people present will be lymphoma consultants, histopathologists who review the biopsies, radiologists whose sort of expertise we need on the scans, colleagues who are experts in delivering radiotherapy when we need to do that, colleagues from palliative care, pharmacy specialist nurses, registrars. So it's a mixed meeting where you discuss, any sort of clinical situation which needs, decision making. Now the decision making is sometimes very clear. Sometimes it takes, more discussion, but it's a way of, protecting people to make sure that you can make a decision with, appropriate levels of oversight and, specialist, input. I mean, what I'd say is that it's not, unfortunately, practical for a consultant to see every single patient every single time because of just the basics of sort of time constraint. But, specialist registrars or specialist trainees, whoever they are under sort of our supervision. So there's always discussion and oversight. And like with any illness, I think, unfortunately, sometimes things are complicated and absolutely need to be sorted out by a consultant. But in other situations, there are other people with the required level of skill set and supervision who can make those decisions, safely.
So can I just quick example then? For example, if you're my consultant, which you're not, but if you were, and I'm due to come in for my 3-monthly checkup tomorrow, and I see one of your registrars, you've discussed me with him or her, and you know exactly what's next for me. So the word has come from you as to what they're going to say to me.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Sometimes the discussion isn't before. Sometimes it's afterwards, and that's also helpful if there are some unexpected points as well. What happened more before COVID and what will happen as well after COVID, when people are having a bit more face-to-face appointments, is also, the consultant's usually next door to the registrar in the clinic room as well. So if there are any concerns at the time, it's very normal for the consultant to come in. But there are always appropriate levels of, supervision and ability to discuss, either specifically in clinic or, more broadly in the MDT, to make sure that people are, looked after safely.
Lovely, thank you. So we've got 5 or 10 minutes left. Does anybody want to ask a question? Yes, Sheena, take yourself off mute.
Hi there. Yes, it's the dreaded COVID question. I wondered if Oxford's doing any trials into the famous antibodies. I'm taking part in one of those at UCLH and, giving my blood periodically, and they're checking to see if or not I've got antibodies. But is there anything on your side that you've got progress with or information on?
Yeah, I think later this year. So we're going to be running a study on passive monoclonal antibody protection against COVID. So there are a variety of antibodies in development which are looking at how you can passively confer protection to people who can't, confer their own immune response. And the aim of that is that you have then sort of your own delivered antibody, which of course can only last in your body for a certain length of time. But if it lasts over a period of time where there may be further or other waves of COVID, that you have some level of protection. So that is a study that is going to be running through Oxford and Imperial.
Okay. And
maybe 2 or 3 other centres. When it is open, I will sort of feed that information back to WMUK so people will be aware of that study, because I think it's just being worked out at the moment, the exact populations that are going to be eligible for that study. But it's a haematology study. Okay, so I think it's likely to be open to any patient with haematological malignancy potentially.
And will you go on that with some, for example, if UCLH is doing research as well, does that all get pooled, or does everyone do their own thing?
I mean, it doesn't get pooled if it's a different study, but if you're on a study where they're just checking your bloods every so often, there's no reason why you couldn't go onto the study.
Thank you. We're going to take one more question. That's from Chris O'Dwyer.
Do any of the drug trials, especially like the Clover, are they promising with regard to a complete response? And in future, would you expect those drugs to sort of be developed into a cure, the utopia of what we want, or are they always going to be? All the trials seem to be very treatment led.
I think drugs are going to be developed over the next few years, and I think it's going to be likely that combinations of drugs, potentially offered at first line, may provide very sustained remissions, which eventually translate into functionally having very, very prolonged remissions. I certainly, it's too early to start talking about cure, but we do know that other low-grade diseases with novel agents, people are actively looking at, for example, in CLL, they're looking at when they can stop potentially. People have had ibrutinib is a frontline treatment in combination with venetoclax. Can you get to a point after X years when you literally cannot detect the disease at all, where you just stop it? And then is that equivalent to a potential cure, long-term remission? But none of the drugs I've talked about today, are going to be curative by themselves in the trials that I've talked about.
Thanks, Jaimal. I've got two more people. They're a shy bunch, and now they're all putting their hands up. I've got two more. Can you take two more questions, Jaimal, please?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, sure. So, Catherine?
Yeah, mine is just a very personal question. I'm about to have my first appointment at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. Would I be better asking for a referral to the Churchill, or should I just stick with Stoke Mandeville?
It's entirely up to you. I mean, I'll give you a personal response. I do a day a week at Stoke Mandeville, so I can see you at Stoke Mandeville if you prefer. So that's fine.
Brilliant.
Just ask a second.
Thank you.
Okay, no problem.
That was cheeky, Catherine. That was cheeky. Okay, and one more question. Sorry, Linda and Gary, I can't take you, but I'm going to take Mark. You were next. Mark, you're on mute. Okay. All right, we'll take yours then, Gary. Come off mute.
Okay. Yeah, hi there. What Dr. I can't pronounce it, Kothari said about being very secure as far as trials are concerned. I've previously been on 2 trials some time ago now, and I was very, very skeptical regarding going onto a trial. But having spoken to Professor Dyer at the Hope Clinic, which is the trials unit in Leicester, and all the other consultants that I've dealt with over the years, and I didn't have any qualms of going on to a phase 3 trial because it's certainly proven to a certain level. And it was great. I went on to tirabrutinib, which worked for 18 months, but unfortunately, Waldenstrom's found its way round. And I went on then to a phase 1 trial. I can't remember the name because I think I was number 2 in the world that went on it, but unfortunately, I did have a very bad reaction, and that trial has since been closed. So I just thought I'd say that in relation to what Dr. Jaimal said. But what I'd like to ask you, Jam, is I'm just being investigated for anti-MAG and peripheral neuropathy. And I know that ibrutinib and both rituximab are used for treatments. And there is a possibility, I'm seeing my hematology consultant next week, that my counts are now beginning to increase because I've been on full partial remission for the last 2.5 years. So is there any preference, and obviously this is just your view, of whether rituximab or ibrutinib are more effective? And also from that, are there any new trial drugs for anti-MAG neuropathy?
Thank you. Thank you for that personal reflection on clinical trials, because I think that's actually probably the most helpful. It very much also reflects, I hope, what I was trying to put forward is that, a phase 3 study, a drug is likely to work. It did work in you well, but then the
Keep freezing.
The phase 1 study, unfortunately, and that does happen. Everyone can hear me. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. With regards to anti-MAG, it's really, I might just switch my camera off so I can hear. I can speak to everyone. So with anti-MAG, it's actually it's a very important point. We're actively trying to understand how to do better clinical trials in this very difficult area. There's much more data for rituximab-based treatment rather than ibrutinib in this setting. And I think if it's just the neuropathy that's causing you a problem, I think my view is using rituximab first is better rather than ibrutinib. But there may be other reasons to consider ibrutinib as well. But if you're in Leicester, they're a great team in Leicester, so I'm sure you'll get the right care.
Great, thanks very much.
Okay, guys. Well, Jaimal, thank you so much. You've given us an hour. You've given us more than an hour of your time this morning. We really do appreciate it. I think this was a fantastic webinar, very informative. Just thanks so much. I'd also like to thank Jo, our new WMUK manager. She's on there somewhere. She's helped me run this morning, so thanks, Jo. So Jaimal, thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.
Oh, it's all a pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Joe. Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.
And the rest of you, nice to see you all. I shall see some of you this week. We've got Scotland, we've got Ireland, and we've got the Northwest groups this week. So I'll see some of you on those. And take care, everybody. Bye-bye.